Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CIFAL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the sixth session of our Climate Change and Global Occupational Health and Safety Speaker Series in partnership with the Restore Lab at the University of Toronto, the Datalay Institute for Global Health Research, and the Global Labor Research Center. I will begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Tekaronto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I would like to welcome our speaker and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. And I would also like to welcome our moderator. It is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Raphael Costa. As an economic development and public management professional, Dr. Costa helps communities build local and organizational capacity and seize their unique opportunities. With more than 10 years in the not-for-profit academic and municipal sector and local economic development, he has helped communities develop and implement strategies, programs, and policies designed to maximize community potential. This includes developing strategic plans and working in entrepreneurship development, social enterprise, sector and cluster development and innovation, manufacturing, the creative industries, and placemaking. Dr. Costa earned a doctorate focused on community and economic development and has a master's in public administration. He stays active in the economic development profession as a member of the board for the Economic Developers Association of Canada and as an expert in cluster development and social enterprise for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities International Programs. Dr. Costa, thank you very much for moderating today's session, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I apologize, everyone. The wonderful world of technology, it wasn't agreeing with me. So thank you, and thank you, Ali, for your assistance there. Just a couple housekeeping things before I introduce Professor Shan. We will be having a presentation for probably about 20-30 minutes from Professor Shan, and then we'll be opening the floor up for questions. At that point, I'll be moderating those questions, but please do feel free to use the chat function to put questions at that point, and we'll do our best to get to a number of them as we move forward. So with that, I'll introduce Dr. Shan, Professor Shan. She's an assistant professor at the Faculty of Medicine at Memorial University of Newfoundland. She received her PhD from Cardiff University in 2017. So still very new too. And she held the Ocean Frontier Institute postdoctoral fellowship beforehand at Dalhousie University, and a number of other fellowships. She is now conducting research, however, on projects on maritime occupational health and safety in Canada, including Arctic maritime occupational health and safety issues, occupational noise exposure on merchant fishing vessels, and she has been awarded 16 research grants from international and Canadian funding agencies, including the ILO, the International Labour Organization, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Transport Canada, Canada First Research Excellence Fund, Memorial University of Newfoundland, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and On the Move Partnership and Return to Work Policy and Practices Partnership through MyTax and Clear Seas. So with that, I'll hand it over to our speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Raphael, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Francisco. So let me try to share the screen. Okay, so Francisco, could you please kindly let me know, could you please see the slide now?
Yeah, I can see the slide. It's not in presenter view, but
let me try to and then remote. So could you see the full screen?
So it looks almost full screen, but it's still showing like if you're in your PowerPoint
Okay.
application. But I think it's big enough if we can't get it. Oh, there it is. Actually, that's perfect.
Perfect.
Okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for CIFAL's invitation. So it's my great honor to join today's session, to join the Climate Change and Global Occupational Health and Safety seminar series. So today my presentation topic is climate change and Arctic maritime activities and occupational health and safety perspective. So in today's presentation, I will first explain the research background. So that would include the increased maritime traffic in the Arctic and the COVID-19 since 2020 in the Arctic region. So secondly, I will briefly introduce our research question. This study is basically empirical study, applied health study. So we basically adopted mixed methods to explore the research question and the occupational health and safety challenges faced by Canadian seafarers in the Arctic. So certainly I will share some preliminary findings from this project. First is the occupational health and safety hazards reported by Canadian seafarers related to Arctic navigation. Second is the COVID-19 related occupational health and safety challenges for Canadian seafarers. And thirdly is we will look at how the pandemic exacerbated Arctic maritime occupational health and safety challenges. Then at the end, I will provide a summary policy recommendation and also explain our next step of the study. The increasing loss of sea in the Arctic is expected to result in significant growth and change in various forms of maritime activities taking place in the Canadian Arctic. Basically, in this series, plenty of discussion have been made regarding climate change and how climate change can amplify existing health and safety issues and could lead to new anticipated hazards for working people. So it has been identified that climate change may threaten the workers' health through high temperatures, air pollution, extreme weather, and natural disasters, and even biological hazards. But as another result of climate change, some business would see that as opportunities. So in the case of maritime transportation, the whole maritime sector actually were quite excited about the opening of the Arctic. And maritime transportation workers are now required to undertake increased voyages in the polar water. And that is not just in Canada, but also in the Russian side, the north. There are two transit passages in the Arctic area. One is the Northeast Passage on the Russian Federation side. The other is the Northwest Passage on the Canadian side. So in Canada, we actually also observed a significant increase of the high Arctic maritime activities. So the significant growth, not just in one specific sector, actually, we are observing fishing, cargo, cruise, shipping. So all have been increased significantly. So last year, I observed that the expansion of Arctic voyages between 2005 and 2016. So according to his research, fishing voyages north of 60° north increased more than 6 times between 2005 and 2016. It's also found that due to climate change, certain fish and shellfish stocks, such as snow crab, polar cod, Arctic Greenland shark, and some redfish also have high potential to move to the subarctic, to the Arctic Ocean. So that will also increase future fishing activities in this area. If you're looking at the Arctic shipping, so basically cargo part. So the northern maritime region of Canada comprises of Arctic Ocean, Beaufort Sea, Hudson Bay, Foxy Basin, Baffin Bay. There are also several canals and straits link those islands of the Arctic archipelago. So we see basically gradually year by year, there is an increasing loss of sea ice, and more Arctic region is opening to the maritime shipping. So Arctic seaweeds are also used for support the resupply of the northern communities. So export of raw materials, cruise for sovereignty, tourism, and science. So from 2009 to 2019, the maritime traffic in the Arctic basically multiplied by 1.9 times in the Canadian Arctic. So the shipping traffic in the Arctic had undergone dramatic changes, with almost tripling of the total distance traveled between 1990 and 2015. So before this 2009, actually Arctic was not being seen as a major maritime shipping or maritime traffic region. But with the global warming, with the decrease of the sea ice, more and more transportation opportunities is being developed and being utilized in this area. And we can also see a shift from the vessels with lower hull strengthening to a large increase in some categories such as pleasure craft, bulk carrier, and passenger vessels. So cruise vessel, tourism vessels also become very much interested to develop this area and provide the Arctic cruise services for their passengers. And the increased maritime traffic in the Arctic also means that more and more Canadian seafarers are involved in the Arctic navigation, are involved in working in the high Arctic area. So compared to the general portion of the world shipping traffic, Arctic shipping still constitutes a very small proportion. And most of the Arctic transits, marine transits, basically concentrated in the Northeast Passage on the Russian Federation side. And Russian Federation also have their national strategy to provide search and rescue, to provide facilitators to help international fleets to translate through the Arctic on the Russian side. Well, on the Canadian Northwest side, it's not being viewed mostly for international transits, but still is basically playing a major role in the resupply transits for the northern communities, in particular the indigenous communities in the north. Between 2005 and 2017, about 2,600 ship accidents were reported in the Arctic. And among these 2,600 accidents, 133 accidents were reported in Canada, ranking fourth after the United States, Russian Federation, and Iceland. So working in the Arctic is an unprecedented occupational health and safety challenges for seafarers because that involve very different navigation related hazards, including ice navigation. And if you're familiar with Titanic, when you're thinking about iceberger and how iceberger could harm the hull of the vessel, that would be a concern. Topside icing, so basically in the cold Arctic North, basically there would be ice gradually built upon the top side of the vessel. So that will affect the stability of the ship. Low temperature, in particular in the earlier season and later season, intense ultraviolet light, uneven day and night durations, high latitudes, remoteness, and climate variable will also affect visibility and sea conditions regarding the Arctic navigation. So what are the current legal instruments protect our Canadian seafarers? So unlike general workforce, seafarers usually are subject to special occupational health and safety rules. And maritime occupational health and safety is also an overlap area between maritime safety and occupational health and safety. So if we take a look at the international level, in the maritime safety area, occupational health and safety also being viewed as part of the human factor approach. And the regulatory purpose is to eliminate human errors in the current maritime operation. So to achieve that purpose, there are certain international maritime safety conventions, including International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification, and Watchkeeping for Seafarers, International Safety Management Code. Maritime Labor Convention is basically primarily emphasizing on the labor rights of the occupational health and safety, while the other two instruments is mainly focusing on how to eliminating human errors, how to make sure that seafarers are competent to work on board the vessel safely. At the Canadian level, similarly, we have the Canada Shipping Act, basically regulate the technical safety part of the Canadian shipping, and also have the Canada Labor Code Part 2 applicable to all the federal workers working on the vessels and maritime occupational health and safety regulations. Unlike most workers subject to provincial occupational health and safety jurisdiction, seafarers on board Canadian vessels are subjected to the federal jurisdiction. And that federal jurisdiction actually not being implemented and enforced by Labor Canada, while Labor Canada authorized Transport Canada to implement and enforce Canada Labor Code Part 2 Occupational Health and Safety regulation on Canadian vessels. So under the Canada Shipping Act, there are also interesting standards related to occupational health and safety. Even though it's a technical shipping act, it still includes Maritime Labor Convention scope and into the marine personnel regulations, and also safe working practice regulations. Under the Canada Labor Code Part 2, there is a Maritime Occupational Health and Safety regulation, which actually provide more comprehensive requirement standards for the safety on board the Canadian vessels. I assume that we probably are all kind of familiar with the three basic occupational health and safety rights in Canada. So as a Canadian worker, there are three basic occupational health and safety rights. So first is the right to refuse unsafe work. Second is the right to participate in workplace health and safety activities, either through a health and safety committee or as a worker health and safety representative. All the workers also have the right to know or to be informed about actual and potential dangers at work. But things for Canadian seafarers are quite different. So for the normal procedure to exercise the right to refuse work if danger, if a worker has a reasonable cause to believe there is the existence of danger at work, the employee may refuse to work unless that refusal may cause some other person directly in danger or the danger is a normal condition of work. But if a seafarer would like to exercise right to refuse work if danger, things would be more complicated. So there is no straightforward entitlement for a seafarer to exercise the right to refuse work if danger. The seafarer needs to notify the person in charge, who is usually the captain or chief engineer, of the danger. If the chief engineer or the captain decide, no, even though it's danger, then it's not, the refusal is not permitted, then the seafarer basically has no choice but to continue his or her work. So this type of restriction basically is to prioritize the ship's safety, to let the captain and chief engineer to make all the safety decisions on board the vessel. So that kind of to compromise employees' rights, occupational health and safety rights, but to prioritize the overall safety decision of the vessel. If we look at the COVID-19 has significantly changed human activities in the ocean, and actually it turns out to be a humanitarian crisis at sea for people working at sea. Since early 2020, basically, there are kind of millions of reports that the port limitations, travel restrictions, to ban seafarers to take crew exchanges, to take shore leaves, and even ban their emergency access to medical care. So in some extreme cases, several seafarers passed away due to the denial of the emergency medical care request. International Maritime Organization also organized a special task force to help international seafarers to get access to medical care, crew exchange opportunities, basically trying to facilitate that process. But unfortunately, in some cases, seafarers do pass away. And even in the case of their deaths, there is even no port state would accept their bodies. And in one extreme case, an Italian captain infected COVID and without medical care passed away on board the vessel, and the body was frozen in the fridge on board. No port states will facilitate the body transport back to his home country. So the vessel later decided to denavigate to Italy, and only the home country of the captain eventually accept his body back home. So COVID-19 put maritime workers around the world in very precarious situations, and seafarers experiencing growing humanitarian crisis. The United Nations General Assembly on December 1st, 2020, adopted a resolution pointing out that the challenging labor conditions of seafarers and fishers have been further exacerbated by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and related response measures. But what's the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Arctic maritime occupational health and safety have not been fully examined. Very limited studies have been conducted to understand seafarers who are subject to the Arctic occupational health and safety challenges, as well as the COVID-19 related occupational health and safety challenges. So in this project, our research question is, what are the occupational health and safety challenges faced by Canadian Arctic seafarers, in particular during the pandemic? And what are the regulatory gaps in the maritime occupational health and safety law? As researchers, we are also subject to the lockdown and public health measures, travel restrictions. So we conducted a review of the Transport Canada ship safety bulletins regarding COVID-19 pandemic, and the protocols for the vessels to adopt in the Arctic and in Canada. I also conducted media coverage analysis, and I conducted 20 semi-structured interviews between 2020 and 2021 with 9 seafarers, 4 union representatives, and 5 managers from Arctic shipping companies, and 1 independent maritime consultant, and also a maritime accident investigator. So semantic analysis has been conducted to analyze these transcripts. So as a finding of this research, here are some common occupational health and safety hazards reported by the seafarer. The first one is coldness. It seems to be easy to understand that if you navigate in the high Arctic, you're expecting to be exposed to low temperature. But there is also another layer, because the Arctic shipping season is starting from June and usually finish in November. If the weather and the sea condition permit, usually 3 voyages will be scheduled. Usually the low temperature would be a concern for the first and the last voyage. So basically earlier in June or later in November. So that is basically the most challenging part for the coldness. And in particular for the late season, in particular in November, then there would be topside ice accumulated on board the vessel. So it's basically as the second picture showed. So then to ensure the vessel stability, seafarers need to chip off all those ice. So that will require prolonged exposure to low temperature. Hypothermia and frostbite would be safety concerns for the crew. The second challenge is ice navigation. So as I earlier mentioned, it's about the growlers. So those growlers is a kind of iceberg, but those are usually old, thick ice. And it's usually only have a small tip above the water while the main body is below the water. So it's very difficult to detect on radar. So they could create severely damage to the vessel. The third challenge is reported the strong winds and rapidly changing weather. Why that would be a concern? Because people would ask, actually in other sea area, you could also face strong winds and rapidly changing weather. That is part of shipping. The issue is in the Arctic, there are almost zero, not just limited, but zero facilities for the port and terminals. So not only the vessel need to do the carriage, but also the crew need to take care of all the discharge. So how they do the discharge is they need to launch a tug and barge at sea, and then load all the cargo to the barge using the tug to drag it ashore. If that would be the case, then any sea changes will affecting their discharging operation. So that's why strong winds and those changing weather will create more dangerous working conditions for crane operations for the discharging operation. So lack of daylight, so that's also a concern reported by the seafarer. So that is usually around October and November. So the darkness during the day increase, and the ice navigation in the dark can be very stressful, and the risk of striking icebreakers are increased. Remoteness and the uncharted narrow passages. So even though with technological development, there are more Arctic navigation activities, still there are many areas in the Arctic still uncharted. So without proper charting service, the vessel may run into the risk of running ashore or grounding. So once struck, the crew may need to wait more than 12 days or more for the most nearby Coast Guard rescue. And also the remoteness not only means that they are far away from any infrastructure, also their internet access, their signal access, their satellite access may not be as stable as in the south. So sometimes the captain and chief officer need to make some decision without sufficient data as they have in the north, in the source. So this is basically Chief Engineer's account, Chief Engineer Bob's account. So basically he said the sub-zero temperatures and harsh sun and complete isolations, no mobile network or everything. Like socially, you're cut off basically with the vessel wall for a while. And yes, those things do make it challenging in the Arctic. I think the workload increases because you don't have a lot of infrastructures and you work with a shortage of these terminals. So yes, those things make it a lot hectic in the Arctic. For most Canadian seafarers in the south, after each voyage, they usually could get, let's say, 2 weeks or 4 weeks leave, basically get reunion with their families. But because the Arctic navigation season is usually short, just from June to November, so most time, all the Arctic seafarers need to do their voyages back to back. If they live in Montreal, so basically the major southern port, they could probably have 1 day off to get reunited with their families. And during the pandemic, because of the restriction of the infection management plan adopted by the company and also required by the Northwest Territory government, then basically seafarers even lose those opportunities as well. So during the pandemic, northern communities have much stricter COVID-19 public health measures, and shore leave were completely banned for the whole 2020 and 2021 navigation season. And in the southern ports, basically, if that is an essential one, for example, access to some medical care is still possible for seafarers to take essential shore leave, but in the Arctic navigation, basically the complete ban. The government of Nunavut basically does not allow any shore leave, and also to protect the residents in the northern communities. The shipping companies even develop a kind of readapt a container, trying to avoid any direct contact between the crew and the community members. So crew exchanges previously, before COVID-19 in the north, would be very difficult. That usually being taken by small charter planes, but during the pandemic, actually, it's become mission impossible. And for the accommodation hotel issues, because also the vessel need to do the loading, need to in particular discharge in the north. before pandemic, what they could do is they could basically fly their stevedore crews to the northern community. And during pandemic, that also being banned. So all these stevedores need to join the vessel to be transported to the north. So that actually created, reduce the living and living accommodation room for the seafarers on board. So that the maritime consultant put, so travel restrictions and isolation is very tough, very challenging for the crew, and not so bad once you get on board, but when you return, because it's very difficult to travel. Most companies are extending your rotations because it's so difficult to travel. And so it make it inexpensive for the companies. So the travel restrictions on one hand is trying to manage the infection, manage the pandemic, but for the seafarer side, we also witnessed this in the Arctic seafarers. So their rotation, their voyages just being extended. And it's basically for some of them not possible to finish their job. They're basically being trapped at sea. Public health guidance, in particular social distancing, sometimes it may work online for sure, but on board it's usually not that feasible. So as a second officer commented, so he said, okay, we don't touch anymore, but it's impossible to make 2-meter distancing because you kind of got everything closed here. The ship elevators are not designed to keep 2-meter distancing. You stay away and it's not designed to give you 2-meter distancing. Okay, the work is also not designed to give you that 2-meter distance. It was very crowded area. And if someone gets positive of his symptoms, it's practically everyone on board then. So we have no idea what to do. So during pandemic, even though there are some recommendations, guidelines being published, but for seafarers on board vessels, those guidelines have very limited effects on them, not really helpful. And actually the travel restrictions further exacerbate their pre-existing occupational health and safety challenges. Fatigue and stress were two main concerns in maritime safety. So not only because of the long working hours, so probably haven't give everyone an idea how long that could be. So according to the Marine Personnel Regulation, the minimum hours of rest could be as low as 6 hours, 24 hours. So it's legally to keep a seafarer to work 18 hours per day in 24-hour period. And in any 48-hour period, so basically minimum hours of rest would be 16 hours. So it's still possible to have a regular shift, let's say between 12 hours to 16 hours per day. And that is 7-day, 24-hour rotation. So those shift work, long hours, lack of sleep, plus the challenges in the Arctic, crew members are more fatigued toward the end of the voyage. And during the pandemic, the short breaks between the voyages were canceled. Stress and depression, basically, we also ran an international survey among Canadian seafarers during the pandemic, and seafarer stress level, depression level, anxiety level is significantly higher compared to general community, and also even higher compared to international seafarers before the pandemic. And in the Arctic, with very, very limited internet access, they were not able to communicate with their families and loved ones regularly. So to sum up, Canadian Arctic seafarers face multiple layers of occupational health and safety challenges during the pandemic, and even before the pandemic, and also after the pandemic, is the environmental challenges. So the ice, the weather, the coldness, the unpredictable sea conditions, the lack of maritime infrastructure, and the lack of search and rescue resources. The isolated working environment also makes their mental health even more challenging. I recently have a PhD student. She's also doing her cadet training. So she last week sent me a note. She said that being a cadet on board the vessel is the worst time in my whole life. So then that actually, the COVID-19 related public health measures. So currently she's actually not subject to the public health, COVID-19 related public health measures as before. but it still makes her feel extremely isolated, extremely stressful. And the COVID-19 actually during that particular time exacerbated the challenging labor conditions for Canadian Arctic seafarers. But shipping as an essential service could never stop. No matter what happens, shipping is still being there. Supply chains still need to be maintained. So maritime occupational health and safety challenges should not be ignored by the public health governance and maritime safety governance in the Arctic. The current regulation and governance approach, basically with very limited consultation with this essential workers group, during the pandemic, they established the National Seafarers Welfare Board and being led by the Transport Canada and trying to increase the voice of the seafarers' voice in the policy making and the decision-making process at the federal level. So there should be more port-based and community-based maritime welfare facilities, and also that need to be developed as the core Arctic maritime infrastructure to support this group of essential workers. So that's basically everything about my research. I would like to acknowledge that this research was funded by the Ocean Frontier Institute, Clear Seas, and Memorial University. So the work was done in collaboration with the National Seafarers Welfare Board and various maritime welfare organizations. Special thanks to our unsung heroes, seafarers who continue to carry essential goods to the Arctic, to Canada, and to the world, despite facing tremendous challenges. Our next step, basically, also have ongoing data analysis. We almost finished the data collection, and we basically currently doing data analysis on the essential workers' mental health challenges at sea during the pandemic, which is funded by CIHR, Canadian Institute of Health Research. So hopefully we can share more findings from this study maybe next year. So that's all about my presentation today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Professor Shan. And for the audience, there is a Q&A button and the chat. So feel free, please, to put questions there. But I am happy to get us going, of course. Did anybody, I'm just reviewing, got my questions, answers. I don't see anything yet, but maybe we can start with a general question. And thank you again, Professor Shan. I think that's really interesting, and I think from a sort of a policy framework perspective and a policy development perspective, it's a very interesting case of sort of the idea of a wicked problem, right? Like here you have this extraordinarily extreme environment that because of climate change is opening up and is providing, as you alluded to, opportunities for international commerce, for local commerce. So just to start, I'm wondering if in your research and in your policy recommendations, you've looked at any other similar jurisdictions of, perhaps there's different extreme environments that has a really loose that maybe has a really loose legislative context, like Canada's North, in which more and more people are working and they're doing so dangerously. So just sort of curious about that jurisdictional scale.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much, Dr. Costa. Actually, for maritime jurisdiction is in most, let's say, in United States, in Europe, in China, it's always a specialized jurisdiction. So it's, let's say, basically in Europe, basically they have the European EMSA. So basically the European Maritime Safety Agency. And they also have the European level maritime safety regulations. For the Arctic, it's basically the most recent decade, let's say 2009. So then there are some forums. So it's mostly at the very earlier stage to regulate. The most prominent one currently we have is the Polar Code. So Polar Code started to regulate, usually it's first to regulate technologies. So what kind of vessel you are seaworthy to go to the north. And usually the human element, let's say the people's right people's occupational health and safety coming much later compared to the equipment CRC. So if we're talking about other jurisdiction, Russian Federation probably would be a place to do a comparative analysis, but unfortunately, my Russian is 0. So that is basically the challenge for me actually to look at a comparative analysis with that jurisdiction. For the European side, I would say it's basically the primary one is to implement the Polar Code being adopted by the International Maritime Organization, and through some forum and consultation, and then trying to impose additional safety measures, infrastructure development, and also, let's say, community. So community engagement, community collaboration. In Canada, particularly with the Indigenous communities in the North, because this is basically Indigenous communities being affected most by the increase of Arctic shipping. On one hand, Arctic shipping could benefit the sustainability of the northern communities. But on the other hand, if, let's say, pollution, safety accidents, marine casualty occur, that would be huge pressure and burden for the northern community. So one of our recent, let's say, exercise with the northern communities is giving them kind of a scenario. If a cruise vessel basically grounded and need to be evacuated, would this northern community, first, are they willing to accommodate these people? They say, yes, of course, we would like to help them. But then say, do you know how many of them? Thousands, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. And they say, if those people come into my community, my food storage, fuel storage couldn't sustain a week. So that is a huge unprecedented scenario for those northern communities. So if we're thinking about the cross-jurisdictional comparative analysis, actually, as far as I know, we can probably learn more from a European side, but at the same time, Canada, as this federal provincial, is still very different from the European structure. And we still need to face some special issues on Canadian side. So we're probably not easy to learn from others, but probably need to be quite creative and make some our own Canadian efforts to address this issue. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And I do have a couple more questions, but there is one from the audience, so I'll ask that if you don't mind. Sure. And the question is about sort of again, speaking about working in extreme weather, and I think the question gets back to sort of your time horizon. You know, you mentioned looking at sort of the last 10 years, but the audience member is just curious as to how climate change has affected working in the Arctic and extreme weather. So obviously, yes, climate change, and I'm extrapolating perhaps from the question. So please, if I'm doing this incorrectly, please type in the chat or the Q&A. But you know, obviously, climate change has opened up shipping routes, but climate change will also make it colder when it's cold, right? Yeah. So I think the question is getting at, you know, essentially how climate change has affected the already extreme weather in the Arctic and eventually occupational health and safety.
For Arctic shipping, if it's basically we define Arctic shipping into two groups in general. One is transit shipping, the other is destinational shipping. So for destinational shipping, it's actually long existed in Canada. I think could be traced back to 1980s, 1990s. Destinational shipping is basically to provide supplies to the northern communities. Transit shipping is basically the case, let's say, for Chinese vessels coming through the Arctic to reach Europe. So that is basically transit shipping. For climate change, on one hand, increase the transit usage of the Arctic. So people who are unfamiliar, let's say those Chinese, Indian, Filipino seafarers have no idea about what it would be in the Arctic. So they are basically being required to do this Arctic shipping. And for them, the occupational health and safety challenges due to the lack of knowledge. So there was a Chinese captain's journal note basically about his voyages through the Arctic. And as a result, all his crew basically suffer frostbite and lack of equipment, because it may not, even though they did the seaworthy test, everything, but they not necessarily provide PPEs for these seafarers. For Canadian seafarers, yes, the destination, basically we're fully equipped to have plenty of local knowledge and regarding this area. But for Canadian seafarers, it's more frequently you need to basically do those supplies because the northern community also grow. If we're talking about climate change, some observation, not, I wouldn't say scientific observation, but more anecdotally from the ship owners representative, is saying it's not getting warm linear, but sometimes 2 year warmer, 1 year getting colder, and then it's become warmer again. So that probably need more systematic scientific observation, data collection regarding that. But it's kind of, I have to confess that is beyond my knowledge. I received training as a social legal researcher. So for those scientific data, I really need to learn from other researchers if they have this data collection, data observation. But yes, it's true. Global climate change, not necessarily if we say global warming, we see the decrease of the ice in the Arctic, not necessarily a linear process. It's always more complicated than we expect. So actually that makes seafarers have to face unpredictable challenges every year. So you can't just copy and paste your last year experience. Maybe this year more ice. And last year, probably you just say, okay, it's probably ice-free, try to avoid ice, even though there is some ice-breaking service. But not all vessels conducting Arctic carriage would be equipped to the icebreaker. In most cases, they need Coast Guard to provide ice-breaking services. And if they're unfortunately being trapped in the ice, they have to wait there. They could wait several days to wait for the Coast Guard to basically provide them search and rescue, to provide them ice-breaking services.
No, yeah, thanks very much. I think, yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that there was a bit of a follow-up on that. And if I could maybe have a crack at it, and then over to you, Professor. But the follow-up is, so if the temperature is normally minus 40 degrees, but raised to minus 39, like how does that, what are the effects on occupational health and safety? And I mean, if I could summarize, it sounds like one of them is just extreme unpredictability. It increases the unpredictability and the changing nature of things. But are there any other sort of direct changes by 1 degree? Therefore, these will happen in occupational health and safety consideration?
Well, this is a little probably I can put, because as I mentioned, the Arctic navigation season, in particular for destinational shipping, is between June and November. So if we basically trace the Arctic temperature during that time is not, let's say, minus 40 to 39. So the reason they chose that as their navigation season is also because it's more manageable for them. So being exposed to the cold temperature is usually a major concern for the last season, the last voyage. So in November, where there is a top icing. So that is basically exposed to cold temperature, need to be properly managed. In terms of PPE, in terms of, let's say, body watching for each other, because hypersomnia, that's a major concern reported by seafarer. So what they explained to me is like they always work in pairs to make sure that if their hypersomnia occur, there always a body basically could seek help. But if you're saying that if there are any fancy technologies trying to help seafarers, probably as far as I know, no. So they are still use very traditional occupational health and safety measures, trying to reduce certain risk. First, they try to basically select this season, navigation season, is because the temperature is not that extreme in the winter term. So then it could be manageable, but through these 3 voyages, there are still early season and late season challenges. So in that sense, basically, they still use some traditional measures trying to avoid that. So PPEs, basically warm clothes and work in pairs. So for occupational health and safety, actually, another layer about maritime is search and rescue. So basically, we also need to place search and rescue people in the north, and usually they are being there longer. So Coast Guard is the one actually need to be operating all year long in the Arctic. So, but Coast Guard compared to commercial vessels, they usually have more resources. They have more people on board the vessel, and then the vessel, because do not have any cargo capacity, so they could increase certain infrastructure. But still, we have an aging Coast Guard fleet, so we probably need to update them to build new vessels, and that means infrastructure investment. So occupational health safety, if we thinking about that, we always find it's interdisciplinary. It's related to how much resources, how much policy priorities you get, and to ensure the working conditions is reasonable and decent. At the same time, if we couldn't eliminate, we couldn't control the hazards, probably we need to design PPEs, and that's usually the last step.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the questions I had as you were going through is this whole idea of enforcement, right? So, the way you describe it, and in many occupational health safety regimes, the onus is on the employee to identify a risk.
Yes.
But if you're working in a factory in Toronto, for example, it's a lot easier, to your point, to just call up after work and, go to the local authority to report this. Yeah. Enforcement in the Arctic is a different beast, right? So I'm just sort of curious about, perhaps as a final question, beyond the obvious sort of increase in existing resources, what is the ideal sort of enforcement regime once you do update policies around CIFAL?
Well, because first, as I mentioned earlier, the occupational health and safety rights on board is largely compromised. So it's basically considering the special working condition on board. So what we observed during the pandemic is a lot of CIFAL just left the sector, even though the wages, the salary being significantly increased. Some people just say, no, I'm not going to return anymore because this is not being manageable. It's beyond any human being's capacity, basically, to manage that level of isolation. And so it's actually become the shortage, the labor shortage in this area, actually kind of, to some extent, could encourage certain good practices by the ship owners trying to retain their talent. So they provide, let's say, some TV, but that is not really helpful, to be very honest, to help the implement and enforcement. If, for example, let's say for enforcement, there should be sufficient coastal-based infrastructure. So for example, in the South, we have the Seafarer Center. And in Canada, through the Seafarer Center, we established a National Seafarer Welfare Board. So every 2 years, at least, this frontline seafarer representative, seafarer welfare worker could understand the needs of the seafarer rather than keep suffering in silence, first to get the voice being heard. And secondly, it's basically at the infrastructure. When we're talking about port terminal itself, we need technical infrastructure, but we also need occupational health, psychosocial health at workplace infrastructure. So usually I would say, even let's say a welfare worker in the port would provide significant support for that person. Is as a gatekeeper, basically helps them to reach the different authorities and to raise their concerns. Because in the end, occupational health and safety in Canada, we view it as a shared responsibility, employer and employee. But how to get employees' voice heard? So they need to have safe channel to express their safety concerns rather than just report to manager delayed forever and ever. And for the Toronto workers, probably I can call Ministry of Labor, basically Ontario. But if you're on board, to call your parent, to call your family, to call your loved one would be difficult. Then how could you expect them to express their safety concerns? So there always need to be let's say in the port, to have some support mechanism to help the seafarers to express their safety concern, or they just vote by feet. So they left, and which is not uncommon. Actually, after the one of my students, so she did an interview with the Arctic seafarer, and after the interview, that person just said that probably I need to reconsider. I need to think about alternative career. So how to make this industry, how to make that our ocean activity, ocean development jobs become decent, attractive for the younger generation. Even though, let's say, probably some people would say, let's attract them from Philippines, let's open temporary foreign water stream to bring them to Canada. But eventually, there would be a kind of, until the limit, the maximum capacity a person as a human being could take. So if you see that those seafarers from southern countries, from the south, from China, India, after 10 years of their career, they probably would say bye to this job. But then we still need sustainable development in ocean development, in this maritime shipping. So people would say autonomy, let's get rid of human. Well, let's see. I personally do not agree with that, because currently for all those policy, compliance, everything, we do need human beings to be there to do their due diligence. And now you say automation, and is the manufacturing good to take the ultimate liability regarding pollution, regarding collision, or regarding those things? Probably not. So I would say simple and straightforward one, get their voice heard through the coastal infrastructure support. And that coastal infrastructure include occupational health and safety and welfare support mechanism. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And just we are at time, so thank you to everybody. And just as a summary note, I would say that this is a really, from a governance perspective, this is a really interesting example of how a challenge and an opportunity was created by climate change, by our changing environment. And when sort of left up to the free market, obviously things like OHS increases, right? And a great example of where a government and where government as an actor should step in, and to Professor Shan's point, make sure that it's a sustainable, attractive, and useful contributor to our economy and our society. So thank you very much, Professor, and thank you to CIFAL at York for hosting us, and happy to hand it back to Francesco.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just would like to echo my thanks. Thank you, Dr. Shan, for that great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Costa, for moderating the Q&A and for your great follow-up questions and summary of the presentation. This is our last session in the speaker series. I think it was a great way to finish the series. It was a very interesting talk, and I think very timely to the effects that we're seeing currently on climate change, or due to climate change. So I would also just like to thank our audience for participating, as always, being here and asking questions, and just attending our seminars, our sessions. Just as one final note, I would just like to remind everybody that we are active on our social medias. We're on Twitter and Instagram as CIFAL York. We're on LinkedIn and YouTube as well as CIFAL York. So anyone can see the recordings of these sessions on our YouTube channel. And if anyone would like to follow our social medias to learn about our future events and our other ongoing speaker series, just give us a follow, and we always post what's coming up next. So on that note, thank you again to both you, Dr. Shan and Dr. Costa, for being here today and taking the time to present and moderate. I think it was a great session and a great way to end our speaker series on this topic.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Costa. Thanks, Francisco.